So what we're going to do is we're going to talk in Module 6, we're going to deal with debugging your packages, we're going to talk about troubleshooting packages, and we're going to talk about logging your packages. So, debugging. We're talking about debugging during development time, not during runtime. We'll talk later about what to do about troubleshooting things that happen during runtime, but for this we're talking just about development environment. There's several things that can happen. First of all, you can check and see the number of rows that have come through in the data flow path. So you can look in the data flow tab and check and see how many rows are coming from one task to another, and often that will be a red flag. Wait a minute, where did all these rows go, or where are they all coming from? So we can also look at the output window. I'll show that to you in a little bit, and the progress/execution results window. We've seen that a couple of times already. There's something wrong, we go look at the progress window. And I don't remember if I mentioned this before, but while the package is running, it's called progress window or tab. Well, after it's finished, the debugging is completed, it's called the execution results. It's the same thing, it just changes names. So we can look in there. We also have the ability to step through our packages step by step, event by event. And we do that by creating something called a breakpoint. And that when the breakpoint is reached, then it pauses. It doesn't stop execution. All the variable values, all of that state information is there. We can inspect it and start answering questions like, how did I get to this point? Why is it doing that? Kind of a thing. And then we also can take a look at the actual data. We can enable something called a grid viewer, so that we can actually look at the real data, not just how many rows are coming, but the rows themselves. You can even copy it to a spreadsheet or some other source or location and look at the data and make sure that it's really coming through the right way. Now, during production, after we've finished this, we pushed it out and deployed it, and we're running it in a production environment, we have other things we can do. We can do logging, and we can create dump files, but really logging, and that we'll talk about logging later in this module, is what you're really going to be looking for to help you with that. But for now, let's just focus on debugging during development time. So when a package executes, it runs through a series of events. You may have noticed some of them. There are events for on error, so if an error occurs. Or pre-execute, it's an event that occurs immediately before the package starts executing or the task starts executing. So you can check how things are before it executes a particular task, and then there's a corresponding post-execute. You can see what the variables are or whatever you want to look at after the event occurs. So you can do both. So breakpoints are simply, as I mentioned, ways to stop or pause the execution of a task or a package while you examine some things. Look at it, make sure it's right, and then you can continue on. You can set those breakpoints so that they trigger the first time an event occurs, or every time it occurs, or every third time it occurs, or the fifth and larger times. It's very, very flexible. I'll show those to you and show you how to set a breakpoint and how to set them to run at different points. We also have a bunch of windows. Two are really worth noticing. One is called the locals window, and you may or may not have seen it and paid attention to it, but the locals window is visible while the package is running in debug mode, and it displays for you all of the variables that are currently in scope and what their values are. If a variable is not in scope, it won't show up in the locals window. And that's really helpful, but sometimes I want to know not just the values of variables that are not in scope, but I want to know the condition of variables that are not in scope. For that, we have a watch window, and we can look in the watch window and add variables to the watch windows so that it pops up, and even though it's out of scope, it shows me that it has some value or it doesn't. So locals window are variables that are in scope and parameters, and watch window is variables or parameters, whether they're in scope or not. And then we can also have something called data viewers. Data viewers are what I was talking about earlier. You can actually look at the data. So in the data flow tab, you can add a data grid viewer to any of the data flow paths. And then as it runs, it encounters that grid viewer, it pops up, it pauses execution just like a breakpoint would. It pops up that, it looked kind of like a mini spreadsheet worth of the data. You can scroll around in there, and you can copy that data and paste it into something else. Usually I use Excel, but whatever. Paste it into anywhere else and get a full look at that data to find out what's going on. So let's watch that happen. Here's our package we're going to run. It should look fairly familiar by now. It's going to copy a file using a variable called the source file. That's the path and location of that value. So let's take a look at that variable. So there's source file and copied file. The source file is products ddemo files mod 6 products.txt, and it's copying to the same location under a files folder called products.csv. But something doesn't look right here. Let's go examine that folder. Go to ddemo files mod 6. There is no products.txt. There's a products.csv. So I'm thinking the variable value that we've typed in here is probably wrong. Well, but we'll wait and see what happens. But just be aware that it's using those variables. Then it's doing a data flow task where it's taking that file and using that as a source. It's doing a data conversion, and it's converting product ID into a numeric and price into a numeric from whatever they are. And then it's writing that to a staging table. Then after the data flow finishes, we'll come back here and delete that copied file. All right, so something is going to go wrong in here. We kind of want to take a look at this and find out what's wrong. The first way we'd probably notice something is wrong is we would run it and we get an error. We get an error right away. Look at the progress window, right? And the task copy source failed. Well, we knew that. And the reason is it couldn't find a file called ddemo files mod 6 product.txt. We know why, right? Because that file doesn't exist. So let's stop this, come back to our control flow, and I'm going to add a breakpoint to this so I can see in real time what the value of that variable is. To create a breakpoint, I'm just going to right click. I'm going to add or edit breakpoints. And for that particular task, the copy source file task, these are the available events. So we want to take a look at the value of that variable before this ever executes. So I'm going to choose to create a breakpoint on the pre-execute event. Now notice it's going to run every time. Well, in this case, that doesn't matter because it only runs once. But I could, in other situations, choose hit point equals, and hit point is this right here. So I could say hit point equals a certain number, it's greater than or equal to, or hit count multiple. So I could do hit count multiple, set that to 3, and it would, the breakpoint would occur on the 3rd time, the 6th time, the 9th time, etc. We're going to leave it this way. We're going to set it to always. So we'll notice it brings a little red dot there as a visual clue. I'm going to restart this. Now look down here. Here are my windows. There's the locals window and there's the watch window. No variables are in scope yet, so it's not showing me anything. Or I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I haven't added any variables to my watch window yet. But here in the locals window, here are my variables. I need to expand them, but before I do that, it's showing me how long this has been running. The status is it's suspended, and the execution results so far, it's successful. Well, this is pre-execute, nothing's happened, and that nothing has happened really well. So let's expand my variables, and I wish it was different, but it shows you the system variables and the user variables all together. So you have to kind of sort through here, and we see there's the copied file, right? That looks fine. Let's look down for our system, for our user variable for source file. There it is, products.txt. Okay, now I see what the problem is. Now, by the way, you could also right-click on this and add it as a watch. And now it's going to show up in my watch window no matter what. All right, so we know what the error is. Let's fix that. So I'm going to click Stop Debugging. I'm going to go look at my variables, and I'm going to change this to products.csv. Now we'll run it again. Again, we still got the breakpoint there. We have our watch window. We see that it's correct. We can go back to locals window, look at that as well. So now we should be fine. So at this point, we can just click continue, and everything should work well. Uh-oh, there's another problem. What is that? Well, let's look at progress window. We know it isn't our first thing. We fixed that. We scroll down, we see an error here. Data conversion failed while converting the column price to numeric. So if we look at our data flow, sure enough, our data, our derived column, or excuse me, our data conversion is failing, and it's for this, and it's having a problem converting this column, the price column, into a numeric. So let's find out why. Let's stop our execution. I'm going to open up that spreadsheet, products.csv. Ah, I see the problem. It's okay to convert a 0 to a numeric. We're not doing a divide, it's just convert. But how do you convert a dash? We can't. So at this point, we should come back and fix our data, but I want to leave that as an error for later. So I'm not going to fix that there. Instead, I'm just going to look at my data conversion and, well, you know what, let's just leave it there. But you see how you would fix it. You would go in and fix the value in your source data. Let's find out, though, a better way to do that. I'm going to create a grid viewer on the data flow path between my source and my transformation. So I'm going to right-click on the data flow path and enable a data viewer. And notice the little icon that comes up there. And by the way, I could also right-click on it, choose Edit, come here to Data Viewer, and choose only which columns I want. There are only 3 columns. I'll just take them all, thank you. Now when we, actually let me come back here. I'm going to remove this breakpoint since we fixed that problem. So I'll right-click, I'll edit the breakpoints, and I'll just clear that. Let's start it again. The copy file runs fine. I go to my data flow, and here's my data grid viewer, and I see, I see right there, that's my problem. So I can now go fix the problem and go on it and execute this from now on. Questions about any of that? Okay, so that's how you're going to do your debugging in development time. You run it, you can't find the errors, you fix them, you get everything going. Now let's talk about how you log information, because SQL Server does a pretty poor job of logging data about your SSIS package. It pretty much is this package started, this package finished. But as long as there are no errors, that's about all you've got. Well, we want something more than that. So we're going to initiate logging from within our package. So the first concept you need to understand is what's called a log provider. The name is kind of misleading. It's not providing any logging. All the log provider gives us is a place to write the information. So you can write it to a SQL table. So just define a connection. You'll create a connection manager to a table where you'll write this. You can write it to an XML file or to a text file. They really pretty much the same thing. You just create a file level connection manager. You can also write it out to SQL Server Profiler, and that's going to, again, just be a file. It will be a .trc file. The problem with that is SQL Server Profiler is deprecated. It's a going away tool, and it's not really a very good debugging tool anyway, not for this. So I wouldn't recommend that. You can also write it out to the Windows event log. This is, I think, a horrible idea. And the reason is, who reads the Windows event log? My domain admins. Well, what do they have to do with my SSIS package? So I don't like to write to the Windows event log. I would prefer one of these three, and really, and I don't have a good reason for this, but I almost always do a text file. That's just what I do. You can do anything you want. But those are your possible providers. Next subject or next point is, what do you log? What do you actually, if we decide through the provider where to write the information, this is what information do you want? So we have our events. Excuse me. Not all of these events will be available for every task. Some tasks have other events that others don't. But this is the full list of possible events. And then they call it log schema. Basically, it's saying for each one of these events, you can choose to do any or all of these pieces of information. So on the pre-execute event, I could say I want the start time and the end time and the source ID. That's the ID of the actual task. But on warning, I want the computer name, the operator, you know, who's actually running this, and the message text. What was the warning? And I can do different things. Now, let me draw your attention to one thing here, execution ID. Source ID and source name are the ID and name of your package. That will never change. The execution ID is a unique identifier number for each time this package executes. So it may be that it ran once yesterday and now today it fails. You can look at the execution ID, sort everything by execution ID, and get all the failed ones together. So all we're going to do is go in and implement logging and set it up for each executable, so each task, and for the package itself and for any containers, how you want to handle logging. First of all, we're going to look at this SSIS menu. And if I select it, notice logging is there along with a bunch of other things. Just a little pro tip for you. If you choose, there are certain things you can be choosing here, and the SSIS menu is different. This, by the way, is in complete violation of Microsoft's own GUI standards. But if you click on the SSIS menu, and it only shows up this way, and then the SSIS menu will come back. Another visual explanation or clue is the format menu either appears, or if I've selected something else, it goes away and the menu is short. Okay, so we want to make sure we get the full SSIS menu. We'll choose logging. Now, over here is my package and each of the executables on there. My package is called Debugging Demo, and I have 3 executables. Each one of them has a checkbox, and it's a 3-way checkbox. So let me kind of explain. There is an empty checkbox. That means I'm not going to do logging on this thing. You'll notice my package right now is set to not do logging. So no logging is going on. There's also a checkbox. I don't know how to draw this, but it's all grayed out. So like these 3 are right now. It's a checkbox, but they're grayed out. That means that I will do logging if my parent wants me to. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it on my own. So if, for instance, with copy source file here, it's a check but grayed out, it won't do any logging at all because its parent isn't. But if I initiated logging on the package, its parent, it would just inherit the log settings from its parent. Then there is checked with no gray. That means I am going to do logging on my own. I don't care what my parent says. I'm going to do my own. This is the teenage child. This is the obedient child, kind of a thing. So checked with no gray in the background, it says I'm going to have my own settings. I'm going to do it my way. And I don't care whether my parent does logging or not. I'm going to. All right. So I'm going to come up here and check the debugging menu, debugging demo. So the package itself is doing debugging. And all three of these executables are going to inherit those settings. I'm also going to check load data, this task, this executable. So it's going to do its own set of logging. I don't care what my parent says. I'm going to do my own settings for logging. All right. So come back here to debugging demo. Here are our providers that I mentioned. I'll just add a couple. I'll add one for SQL Server, and I'll add one for text files. You could add all you wanted. Each one of them has its own configuration settings, but they are the three, text file, XML file, and SQL Server Profile are just file connection managers. SQL Server is just a database connection manager, and Windows Event Log has no configuration at all. It just writes to the log, so I don't need to configure anything. Now, before I do that, I'm going to open up Management Studio here, and I'm going to create a database. In the real world, I normally, well, I don't create a database, I create a database. I normally have a database on each of my servers. I call it maintenance, it wouldn't matter what you call it. It's just a place to store this kind of information. It's not information pertinent to my business, it's information pertinent to me running my server. So now I can come back here and I've got a log provider for SQL Server. I'm going to configure a connection to it. So I'll create a brand new connection. It's on MIA-SQL is the name of the server, and the database is the one I just created, maintenance. I'll test that connection, and it's good. Now notice it's not asking me for a table name. It's going to take care of that for me. It just needs the connection manager. My text file, I will also create a connection manager. And I'm going to come out here to D drive, and I'm going to create a new folder called SSIS Logs. And that's where I'm going to put this. So I'm going to tell it to create a file. And I'm going to point to that folder that I just created. And I will call it demo logging. And then you can save it as whatever you want. I'm going to save it as .xml because that's what it's really going to end up being. All right, so I've added my my providers, but I haven't. This checkbox right here is saying for debugging demo, the one I'm dealing with right now, where do I want to write that information? I'm going to write that to my SQL Server table. And what do I want to write about it? Well, here are the details. I'm going to do on error, on information, and on task failed. Oh, and by the way, that will do a default set of information or schemas. I can click advanced, and I can then get very specific about what I want to record in an on error. But on information, I really don't care about anything except the execution ID and any messages that comes through. And I can set this up, configure it any way I want. And if you get it set up a particular way and you want to save that, you can just save it. It saves it as a file, and then you can go to other servers and load it in and copy the same thing. All right, But for my load data task here, I want something different. I'm going to write it to a text file, and I'm going to choose all of my events and all of my schemas, all of my possible writing objects. In other words, I really want to record everything about that load data. And notice it has a checkbox with no gray in it. So the settings here for debugging demo will be inherited by these two executables, the copy source file and the delete copy file, but load data is going to do its own thing. All right, let's execute this now. And there's my grid viewer, there's my problem, there's my issue. I can stop this. In here now, if I look under that table or that database that I created, I've got to refresh this, maintenance, and if I expand tables, there's nothing there. Wait, what's going on? Well, this is a system table, and its name is dbo.sys log, and I can simply select from it. And since it's any other, like any other table, you can filter it, you can where it, you can order it by, you can do any of that kind of stuff. But this is all the information I said that I wanted to receive about these events. Or I can come out to where I stored my file, and I'll try to open that with Notepad. Now, some people get freaked out and they don't like looking at it this way. Maybe it's just because I've been doing this for a long time, but the truth is, once you really start to understand how to read these text files as log files, they get fairly easy and they get fairly simple. This is my preferred way of looking at them, but you should do whatever you like. Don't do it my way, do it your way. And that's how you set up logging. Any questions about any of that? Then let's talk about how to handle errors at runtime. So we talked about how to handle errors in debug mode, but how do you deal with errors at runtime? In other words, I've deployed this to the server. It's no longer mine. It's running. Some DBA is dealing with this, and there's an error. Somebody deleted a table, or somebody did something crazy. How do I deal with that? Well, I don't deal with it. My DBA is going to be doing it, but they're probably going to come back and ask me. So we want to be able to set up a way to deal with errors in the package at runtime. So we've got error handling in control flow. We've already pretty much covered that. You're going to deal with your your precedence constraints, and you're going to deal with completed, failed, and successful. And you can also, as we looked at, you can deal with expressions in there. So that's primarily how you're going to deal with problems in runtime in the control flow. You will also have the event handlers that we talked about. But on data flow, I don't have event handlers. So what do I do there? Well, I'll show you, I'll demonstrate this to you in just a second, but you can redirect any rows that are failed. And the general idea, to give you the overview first, the general idea is I'm reading a bunch of records from a table and something goes wrong. Well, one of those records was populated weirdly or something went wrong. I can actually just take that out to an entirely different stream, take a data flow path out for those records that are failed. What I usually do is write it to a text file, and then I go back and review that text file. And then I just deal with the one-offs that way. But you could do whatever you wanted to. So event handlers, again, there's that event handler tab. Every executable and the package itself has a set of events. You can enable an event handler for any one of those events and then write code to do whatever you want. To be perfectly honest with you, the only event handler I deal with at runtime, so in other words, after I've shipped this, is the on error. The rest of them seem to get in the way. But I do have an on error event handler, and it's just a generic one that I copy and paste into each of the executables. And it basically does a logging kind of thing. Now occasionally I'll look at it and say, you know, if it's going to fail here, I know what the problem is. And I might try to kind of self-heal and fix the problem. It doesn't usually work. You give it a try, you do your best. If it's going to work, great, but it probably won't. And so most of the time in the event handlers, I end up just logging very specific information. All right, so let's look at how to handle this in data flow. We've kind of already covered most of the other things in other areas, but we haven't covered this. Same thing here. We're going to copy our source file. We're going to load our data through a data flow. We're going to do the data conversion. It's going to give us an error, and we're going to then delete the file. Now, I'm not going to run it again. We already know the error is going to happen. We know where it's going to happen. It's going to happen right here. So what I want to do is take that row that has the error in it and deal with it one-off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a destination. We'll just do a flat file destination over here. And I'm going to click on data conversion, and you notice there's a red data flow path. This is the error one. I'm going to grab this and drag it over to this destination. And now this pops up. There are only two possible columns, the product ID and the price columns, and there are a couple of possibilities that are problem. One is just a generic error, something went wrong, I don't know what, and the other is a truncation error. I tried to convert this, but it was too long, kind of a thing. I tried to convert the number 256,212 into a tiny int, and it wouldn't fit. That would be a truncation error. To be perfectly honest with you, I have never, so far anyway, distinguished between these. I am just, for my purposes, going to deal with any error. So with any error, you can have one of three possibilities. One, you can just fail the component. That's always the default. And we've seen that. If something goes wrong, this task fails. We can ignore the failure. Not sure that's a wise thing to do, but we can just say, you know what, if it fails, just ignore it and move on, get the rest of the records. Okay? Or we can redirect the row. And that would send that one row out through this data flow path. Well, in fact, that's what I want to do with all of these. So I'm actually going to select, just do a shift click and choose all of my things and tell them to redirect the row and apply it. So now, no matter what column, no matter what error, it's going to redirect the row out to my flat file destination. Now all I need to do is configure this and create a connection manager. So I'm going to create a new connection manager. It'll be a delimited file. I'm going to put that in we'll just put it in D demo files mod 6, and we'll call this error rows or something like that. And I'm going to make it a CSV file so I can open it up in the spreadsheet. And then I will call this error rows CM connection manager, whatever you want to call it. Now I want this to be delimited. I do want the column names in the first row. And here, by the way, we won't need to here, but you might have columns where it contains text like last name, comma, space first, in which case you do not want a comma delimiter. You'd want a tab delimiter or something else. We'll just write this as a column delimiter. We'll preview our data. We won't see anything. But I did want to show you it's going to go those three columns, plus it's going to add the error code and the error column. So what went wrong and which column what went wrong with. Oh, I forgot to look at the mappings. Always makes you look at the mappings. There they are. They're good. Okay. Now when I run this, the error still exists, but this didn't fail. Notice it had 3 rows coming in from the file. 2 rows were written to the staging table, and 1 row was written out to this flat file. It's no longer an error because I dealt with the error by redirecting it to this file. I can come out here and open up that file and see right away. There's the problem right there. So I would need to go back to my source data and fix that, or deal with it one-off situation one way or the other. Without doing this, I end up either just ignoring errors, which is not a good idea, or having my whole package fail, which is also not a good idea. All right.